It was a snowy Christmas Eve, and Emily, a single mother, was doing everything she could to make the night magical for her 8-year-old son, Jamie. Their modest home was adorned with twinkling lights, a glowing Christmas tree, and the aroma of freshly baked cookies filled the air. Jamie couldn't contain his excitement as he bounced around, eagerly awaiting Santa Claus. "Don't forget to leave milk and cookies for Santa," Emily reminded him, placing a warm tray of gingerbread men on the table. As the clock struck 9 p.m., Jamie was sent to bed, but not before he made Emily promise to wake him up if she heard Santa's sleigh. She laughed, kissed his forehead, and tucked him in. Later that night, as Emily wrapped the last of the presents in the living room, Jamie sat awake in his room, staring out the frosted window. Suddenly, he spotted movement outside. A figure dressed in a red suit and white beard, walking slowly down their snow-covered street. His heart raced with excitement. "Santa," Jamie whispered to himself, his breath fogging up the glass. But something wasn't right. The figure wasn't carrying a sack of toys, nor did he seem jolly. He stopped directly in front of Jamie's house, his head tilting upward, staring straight at Jamie's window. Jamie waved hesitantly, and the Santa figure raised a hand in return, but the movement was unsettling. Too slow, too deliberate. Emily had just finished placing the last gift under the tree when she heard 3 sharp knocks at the front door. Knock, knock, knock. She froze. Who would visit so late on Christmas Eve? She glanced at the clock, 11:45 p.m. Grabbing her robe, she approached the door cautiously and peeked through the peephole. Outside stood the same Santa figure Jamie had seen earlier, but Emily didn't know that. "Who is it?" she called through the door, her voice wary. The figure didn't answer but raised a gloved hand holding up a small box wrapped in shiny red paper. Emily's gut told her not to open the door, but curiosity got the better of her. She cracked it open, keeping the chain latch secure. "Can I help you?" The man didn't speak. He slid the box through the gap, tipped his hat, and walked away, disappearing into the snowy darkness. Jamie, hearing the commotion, ran downstairs, his face lighting up when he saw the box. "Is it from Santa?" he asked eagerly. Emily hesitated but eventually let him open it. Inside was a small, carved wooden figurine of a boy sitting on a rocking horse. At first it seemed harmless, even thoughtful, but as Jamie held it, he felt a cold shiver run through him. "Can we put it on the tree?" Jamie asked, but Emily shook her head. Something about the gift didn't sit right with her. She placed it on the mantelpiece instead. As midnight approached, the house grew eerily silent. Emily had gone to bed, but Jamie couldn't sleep. The wooden figurine seemed to call to him, its glossy surface reflecting the faint glow of the Christmas tree lights. Suddenly, Jamie heard faint jingling, like the sound of sleigh bells, coming from the roof. His excitement returned, and he tiptoed to the living room, hoping to catch Santa in the act. But what he saw made his heart drop. The fireplace, which had been dark and empty, now glowed with faint embers, and the wooden figurine had moved. It was no longer sitting on the mantel, but on the coffee table, its position slightly different, its head now tilted toward the window. Jamie froze. "Mom?" he whispered, but there was no response. The sleigh bells grew louder, joined by the sound of heavy footsteps on the roof. Jamie's wide eyes darted to the fireplace as ash began to fall. Then, 2 boots appeared, followed by the rest of the figure in red. But it wasn't Santa. The figure was grotesque, its face pale and cracked like old porcelain, with hollow black eyes and a twisted grin. It dragged a sack behind it, and Jamie could hear faint whimpers coming from inside. Jamie backed away slowly, but the creature's head snapped toward him, its grin widening unnaturally. "You've been waiting for Santa, haven't you?" it crooned, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. Jamie screamed, bolting upstairs to his mother's room. "Mom, Santa's in the house!" he cried, shaking her awake. Emily groggily sat up, confused. "What are you talking about?" Before Jamie could explain, they both heard the creak of the stairs. Emily's face turned pale as she grabbed her phone, but when she tried to call for help, there was no signal. The footsteps grew louder, slower, as if the intruder was savoring every step. Emily grabbed a baseball bat from the corner of the room, motioning for Jamie to hide in the closet. The door creaked open, revealing the figure in all its horrifying glory. Emily swung the bat, but it passed right through the creature as if it were made of smoke. "You let me in when you took my gift," it hissed, reaching for Jamie. Emily screamed and threw the bat at the creature, buying just enough time to grab Jamie and run down the hallway. The house was a maze of shadows, the once festive lights now flickering ominously. "Stay behind me!" Emily yelled, kicking open the door to the attic. She pushed Jamie inside and locked the door behind them. The creature's guttural growl echoed through the house, followed by a chilling laugh. "You can't hide forever," it taunted. In the attic, Emily searched frantically for something, anything, they could use to defend themselves. Her hands landed on an old iron cross that had belonged to her grandmother. When the creature burst through the door, Emily held the cross up, and to her relief it recoiled, hissing like a wild animal. "It's the figurine!" Jamie shouted. "We have to destroy it!" With the creature momentarily weakened, Emily and Jamie raced back downstairs. The figurine was still on the coffee table, now pulsing with an eerie red light. The creature appeared again, blocking their path. "You can't destroy what's mine," it roared, its form flickering between solid and shadow. Emily gripped the iron cross tightly and lunged at the figurine, smashing it to the ground. The creature let out a deafening screech, its body convulsing as it began to dissolve into black smoke. When the figurine finally shattered, the creature disappeared entirely, leaving only silence. The next morning, Emily and Jamie sat together on the couch, still shaken but alive. They decided to burn the remaining pieces of the figurine in the fireplace, ensuring it could never haunt anyone again. As the flames consumed the wood, Emily hugged Jamie tightly. Christmas would never be the same, but they were grateful to have survived the night. It was Christmas Eve, and the snowstorm had arrived earlier than predicted. The roads were impassable, leaving Sarah stranded at her family's old vacation cabin in the woods. The cabin was a rustic, creaky place, far from town and even farther from any cell phone signal. Alone, she decided to make the best of it, lighting a fire in the stone hearth and decorating the small tree her parents had left behind years ago. Her boyfriend Mark had promised to come by after his shift at the hospital, but with the snow piling up and the wind howling like a banshee, she doubted anyone would make it up the mountain tonight. Sarah was halfway through her third glass of wine when she heard it, a loud knock at the door. Knock, knock, knock. Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the cabin was too remote for random visitors. Peering out the window, she could barely make out a figure standing in the swirling snow. "Who's there?" she called through the door, her voice trembling. "It's Mark," a man replied. "I got off work early. Open up." Relief flooded through her as she unlatched the door, but when she swung it open, she froze. The man standing before her wasn't Mark. Dressed in a tattered coat and a knit cap pulled low over his eyes, the stranger smiled thinly. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his breath fogging in the freezing air. "I got stuck on the road and saw the lights. Can I come in and warm up?" Sarah hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to shut the door, but the storm was brutal, and leaving someone out in it felt cruel. She stepped aside, letting him in. The stranger stomped the snow off his boots and rubbed his gloved hands together, his eyes darting around the cabin. "Nice place you've got here," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. Sarah offered him a cup of coffee, her unease growing with every passing second. "So, where were you headed?" she asked, trying to keep the conversation light. "Nowhere in particular," he replied, his gaze lingering on the Christmas tree. "Just passing through." Something about his answer didn't sit right with her. "You're out here in this weather with nowhere to go?" she pressed, her voice wavering. The man chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. Life's unpredictable, isn't it? As they talked, Sarah noticed things about him that set her on edge. His clothes were worn and didn't seem suited for the weather. He didn't shiver or complain about the cold. And his eyes, they were dark and empty, like they held secrets she didn't want to uncover. When he asked if she was alone, she lied. "My boyfriend's on his way," she said quickly. "He'll be here any minute." The stranger's smile widened. "Good," he said. "It's always better with company." As the night wore on, Sarah became increasingly uneasy. The stranger hadn't moved from his spot by the fire, staring into the flames with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She decided to text Mark, hoping he was somewhere with a signal. But when she picked up her phone, the screen was dead. She was sure she'd charged it earlier. The stranger noticed. "Phone trouble?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock concern. Before she could respond, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Sarah's breath hitched as she fumbled for the flashlight she'd left on the counter. "I'll get the generator," she said, her voice shaking. "I'll come with you," the stranger offered, standing abruptly. "No," she blurted, then forced a nervous laugh. "I mean, it's just out back. Stay here and keep warm." The storm had worsened, the wind howling like a living thing as Sarah stumbled through the snow to the shed. She'd barely reached the generator when she felt it, a presence behind her. Whipping around, she saw nothing but shadows. Heart pounding, she got the generator running and hurried back to the cabin. Inside, the stranger was no longer by the fire. The door was ajar, snow blowing in, and something was missing. The small angel figurine that had topped the Christmas tree was gone. Before Sarah could process what was happening, there was another knock at the door, louder and more insistent this time. Knock. 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 She froze. The stranger had been inside moments ago. Why would he knock? Grabbing a kitchen knife, she approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" she demanded. Silence. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, but before she could turn it, the door swung open on its own. There was no one there, only the storm raging outside. But as she stepped back, she saw them. Footprints in the snow, leading away from the cabin. They didn't belong to the stranger. They were too small, like those of a child. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on and Sarah gasped. Standing in the middle of the room was the angel figurine, now life-sized and grinning malevolently. The figurine moved toward her, its glassy eyes glinting in the flickering light. "You let him in," it hissed, its voice echoing unnaturally. "What do you want?" Sarah cried, backing away. "The house," it replied, its grin widening. "This place was ours long before it was yours." Sarah remembered the stories her parents used to tell her about the cabin's dark history, tales of a family that had disappeared one Christmas Eve many years ago. The angel, she realized, was part of that family. Suddenly, the stranger reappeared, his face twisted into something inhuman. He and the angel were connected, their forms flickering as if they weren't entirely solid. Sarah fought back with everything she had, using the knife to slash at the stranger, though it passed through him harmlessly. She threw the angel figurine into the fire, but it only laughed, its form unscathed by the flames. Realizing she couldn't fight them physically, Sarah turned to the old chest in the corner, where her parents had kept family heirlooms. Inside, she found a dusty Bible and a cross. Clutching the cross, she recited the Lord's Prayer, her voice trembling but resolute. The angel and the stranger shrieked, their forms disintegrating into ash as the cabin shook violently. When it was over, Sarah collapsed, tears streaming down her face. She survived the night, but the cabin would never feel like home again. It was supposed to be a quiet Christmas Eve for James, who had reluctantly agreed to cover the night shift at his security job in a high-end apartment complex. The building was mostly empty, as many tenants had left to celebrate the holidays with family. James had been looking forward to a peaceful evening, some Christmas movies on his phone, a few snacks, and no drama. But at exactly midnight, The phone at the front desk rang, breaking the stillness. "Security desk. This is James," he answered, suppressing a yawn. A soft, shaky voice came through. "There's someone outside my door." James straightened in his chair, alert. "Which apartment, ma'am?" "Apartment 13B, she whispered. "He's just standing there. Please hurry." James checked the monitors but saw no one in the hallway near 13B. "Are you sure, ma'am? I don't see anyone on the cameras." "He's there," she insisted, her voice rising in panic. "Please, he's just staring at me." Grabbing his flashlight and walkie-talkie, James headed for the elevator. The thought of confronting a possible intruder didn't sit well with him, but he couldn't ignore the woman's fear. When he arrived at the 13th floor, the hallway was eerily silent. Apartment 13B's door was closed, and no one was in sight. He knocked gently. "Security. Ma'am, it's James. Everything seems clear out here." The door creaked open a fraction, and a pale, elderly woman peered out. "He was right there," she said, pointing down the hall. "I swear it." James nodded, deciding to do a sweep of the floor to reassure her. As he walked down the dimly lit corridor, the hairs on his neck stood on end. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. James returned to the security desk, his shift resuming its usual quiet monotony. But just as he started to relax, the phone rang again. "Security desk," he said. "You didn't find him," the woman from 13B whispered. "Ma'am, I checked the hallway. There's no one there," James replied firmly. "He's back," she said, her voice trembling. "He's standing closer this time." James checked the monitors again. This time, his blood ran cold. On the feed from the 13th floor camera, a tall, dark figure stood in the hallway, motionless. Its face was obscured, and it cast no shadow despite the overhead lights. "Stay inside your apartment," James said, his voice barely steady. "I'll handle this." Grabbing his flashlight, he returned to the 13th floor. But as soon as he stepped out of the elevator, the figure was gone. "Show yourself!" James shouted, his voice echoing through the empty hallway. A door slammed shut behind him and he whirled around, heart pounding. He shone his flashlight down the hall, but nothing moved. When he reached 13B, the elderly woman's door was wide open. "Ma'am," he called, stepping inside. The apartment was empty. The furniture was covered in dust, and the air was heavy with the scent of mildew. It didn't look like anyone had lived there in years. Confused and increasingly frightened, James returned to the security desk. He replayed the camera footage, hoping to make sense of what he'd seen. On the screen, the figure reappeared, this time closer to the camera. Its head tilted unnaturally as if staring directly at James. He watched, frozen, as the figure raised a hand and pointed at something off-screen. The phone rang again, making him jump. He didn't want to answer, but the shrill ring was impossible to ignore. "Security desk," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're next," a guttural voice growled. The line went dead. Panic set in as James scrambled to figure out what was happening. He searched the building's records and discovered a chilling fact. Apartment 13B had been unoccupied for over a decade. The last tenant, an elderly woman, had died there on Christmas Eve, alone and forgotten. James decided to call his supervisor, but his phone wouldn't connect. The building's landline was dead and the power began flickering ominously. Desperate, he armed himself with a metal baton and headed back to the 13th floor. If this was some kind of elaborate prank, he was determined to put an end to it. The hallway was darker than before, the lights overhead dim and flickering. As he approached 13B, the air grew colder, his breath visible in the freezing temperature. Suddenly, the door to 13B slammed shut in front of him. He tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. From inside, he heard whispers, dozens of them, overlapping and unintelligible. The sound grew louder, morphing into anguished cries. "Why didn't you help me?" A voice wailed, sending chills down his spine. James ran back to the elevator, but it wasn't working. The staircase was his only option, and as he descended, he heard footsteps behind him. They weren't hurried, but deliberate, each step echoing through the stairwell. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice trembling. Reaching the ground floor, James bolted for the exit. But when he opened the door, he found himself back on the 13th floor, standing in front of 13B. "No, no, no!" he cried, banging on the walls. Exhausted and terrified, James collapsed in the hallway. The door to 13B creaked open, revealing the elderly woman standing inside. Her eyes were hollow, her expression sorrowful. "You could have saved me," she whispered. Before James could respond, the dark figure emerged from the shadows behind him, its hand resting heavily on his shoulder. James screamed, but no one was around to hear him. By the time the morning shift arrived, the security desk was empty, the monitors flickering with static. James was never seen again.